Hillary Clinton has a new line of attack against her primary opponent, Bernie Sanders, and it is resting on a foundation of truly sickening deception. So this is what she said just yesterday. Sanders frequently says, "We're a small rural state. We have no gun laws. Here's what I want you to know. Most of the guns that are used in crimes and violence and killings in New York come from out of state. And the state that has the highest per capita number of those guns that end up committing crimes in New York come from Vermont." So this is not, "Oh, I live in a rural state. We don't have any of these problems." This is, you know what? It's easy to cross borders. Criminals, domestic abusers, traffickers, people who are dangerously ill, they cross borders too. And sometimes they do it to get the guns they use. So what you're supposed to take from this is that Bernie Sanders' pro-gun record, that's not actually a pro-gun record, is in her mind, and soon in the minds of the residents of New York, responsible for a ton of crime in New York City and the rest of New York. It's a weird coincidence this is happening now. I mean, they have a primary there in just like 6 or 7 more days. Weird. So let's check to see if she's actually being honest. Is Vermont to blame? And by proxy, Bernie Sanders, as a senator from Vermont, is he to blame for this crime in New York? So New York and New Jersey have some of the strictest gun laws in the country. But more than 2/3 of crime guns involved in actual crimes, have come from out of state. Now, there were almost 8,000 guns recovered and traced in New York in 2014, according to the ATF. The tracing is how they find out where the guns originally came from. The source state was identified in a little bit over 4,500 of the traces, and 30% of those were from out of the state, which means that in total, all of the states, yes, out-of-state guns are a significant problem from New York, as they almost certainly will be considering New York's relatively stringent gun laws. In 2013 and 2014, the states where the most number of out-of-state crime guns originated were Virginia, Pennsylvania, Florida, and Georgia. Now, you'll notice immediately that Vermont is not in that list, so why is it that she's talking about Vermont and not casting aspersions on Virginia and Pennsylvania, if those are the places where the guns are coming from? Well, it's because there's an element of truth in this story that she's spinning. The state with the most number of guns per 100,000 people was indeed Vermont, and that is why in her story she throws in per capita. Now, she just throws it in. It's 2 words, easy to forget it and just think, oh, Vermont's the big problem. But she's talking about per capita. Only 1% of crime guns whose sources was identified in 2014 originated from Vermont. 55 guns out of over 4,500. And yet that stat, for some reason, wasn't mentioned by Hillary Clinton. When she's talking about how Vermont is the problem, when she's implying that Bernie Sanders is the problem, she doesn't tell you that only 1% of the guns were actually traced back to Vermont. She says it's the one with the biggest problem per capita. It's the big problem in New York crime per capita. Weird how that works out. Now, let's throw up this chart here so that you can actually see the numbers for 2013 and 2014. I mean, the number of guns in 2013 in New York, obviously the single biggest state there, almost 1,500. Virginia, over 400. Pennsylvania, over 300. Florida and Georgia and North Carolina, South Carolina. All of these states, not universally, but largely in the South, more conservative, more rural areas where they do tend to have more lax gun laws, are much more likely to contribute the guns that actually lead to these crimes. You're seeing Vermont, by the way, dropping from 61 to 55. Now, does that actually mean anything? Not necessarily, because when you're talking about such a small number of guns coming from a state, it could literally be the result of one person trafficking these guns, let alone one gun dealer trafficking these guns. And so you'd expect to see that sort of variation, but it is certainly a small number overall, and yet she doesn't go into that nuance because she doesn't give a shit about that nuance. She wants you to think that Bernie Sanders is leading to people being murdered with guns, or robbed with guns, or raped with guns. She wants to throw all of that on his stoop, even though he's not responsible for it. Now, the Washington Post, who we have been very critical of in the past for what we perceive to be a pro-Hillary slant, in this case gives it 3 Pinocchios. And so they're doing the right thing there. PolitiFact rates it as half true, because in their article, they correctly point out that she is somewhat accurate. Yes, per capita, it's the highest number of guns, but that's not actually, doesn't have anything to do with the actual problem. And if you talk to the people who are quoting all of these stories, who actually are trying to stop the gun problem in New York, they say that Vermont is never even in the conversation. And that's what makes it so deceptive. Unfortunately, if you just read the headline on PolitiFact, it seems like she was telling the truth, which is my beef with PolitiFact. It has to do with their headlines. To the extent that any state is actually to blame for New York's problems, we should be pointing the finger at places like Virginia and Pennsylvania. But she is not doing that now, and I'm sure in another week or two, when she's moved on from New York, she won't even be talking about New York's crime problems, the same as she used to appear in Flint, and she cared so much about their water. How many days has she spent in Flint over the past couple of weeks? Weird, after their primary, she doesn't care anymore. So yeah, go ahead, tell me again how Hillary Clinton has been unfairly called dishonest during this primary. But here at TYT, when she lies, we're going to call her a liar. And that's my final judgment.